Do you think that the gluten-free diet is just a fad? Like all the cool people do the gluten-free diet because it's the cool thing to do? According to Google search trends, the search volume for the phrase gluten-free really spiked in 2013, 2014, showing that's when the gluten-free diet was at its biggest fad stage. And back then you had a bunch of cool people that were doing the gluten-free diet because it was the cool thing to do. You also had a bunch of people that were like, oh, and gosh, it's just a fad, guys. Thankfully, the gluten-free fad diet has tapered off a little bit, but there are still people out there who need to avoid gluten for medical reasons, which would indicate that it's not a fad diet for them. But there still exists a group of people out there that if you tell them that you're gluten-free for medical reasons, they'll still be like, oh my gosh, it's just a fad, and then they'll judge you for it. Well, today I'm going to show that for those who medically need to avoid gluten, that the gluten-free diet isn't a fad. It seems self-explanatory, but apparently it's not still, hence the creation of this video. Another quick note, you see this dip in the Google Trends? This dip happened in March of 2020. That's right, the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Basically, a bunch of people stopped searching for how to be gluten-free and just ran to the store and bought a bunch of gluten because they thought the world was going to end and they needed their gluten comfort food. And that's why the stores ran out of gluten-containing food, and that's why there was still gluten-free food available. Thank you everyone for not buying the gluten-free food. I appreciate it. I am gluten-free, obviously. So besides the fact that I'm not a cool person and I don't do cool things like follow cool fad diets, and besides the fact that I actually have a hard time sticking to anything long-term if I don't need to do that thing because apparently I have commitment issues, and besides the fact that there is no way that my wife would let us eat gluten-free if I was doing it just for a fad diet.
Would you allow us to eat gluten-free if gluten-free was just a fad diet for me?
No.
Besides all that, there are multiple things that show that for those who medically need to avoid gluten, it's just not a fad diet. So the three types of people that need to avoid gluten are those with a wheat allergy, those with non-celiac gluten sensitivity or gluten intolerance, and then those with celiac disease. Celiac disease is an autoimmune disease, which means when you eat gluten, your immune system thinks that gluten is bad and tries to attack the gluten, but then also ends up attacking your intestines at the same time, which is obviously a bad thing. Having your intestines attacked by your immune system is no bueno. Now, gluten intolerance is not an autoimmune disease, so when people with gluten intolerance eat gluten, their intestines aren't damaged, but they can still have really bad and severe symptoms just like those with celiac disease. In fact, the gluten intolerance group says that there are over 200 known symptoms for celiac disease, and a lot of these symptoms are shared by those with gluten intolerance. These symptoms can include severe vomiting, severe diarrhea, severe abdominal pain, and all manner of just gut intestine issues. There's even a pretty severe symptom called gluten ataxia that you can experience if you have celiac disease or gluten intolerance, in which when you eat gluten, your immune system attacks your nervous system, and as part of that actually damages your brain. So by eating gluten, people with gluten ataxia literally have damaged brains, which as you can expect is really bad. You can even die from having celiac disease or gluten intolerance or even a wheat allergy if you consume wheat or gluten. Even severe diarrhea can kill you. And people with celiac disease and gluten intolerance can have severe diarrhea and therefore possibly die from eating gluten. So let me ask you, does avoiding gluten to avoid these over 200 symptoms for celiac disease and gluten intolerance, including severe pain, severe vomiting, including gluten ataxia and having your brain damaged, and including death, does avoiding these symptoms by avoiding gluten sound like a fad to you? Literally, no. It's just so much not a fad. So how do I know that I have celiac disease and that I have to eat gluten-free? Starting in 2013, my intestines went whack and were messed up for about 3 years before I got diagnosed with celiac disease. To get diagnosed with celiac disease, I went to a doctor and they literally stuck a camera down my throat and they literally took a picture of my intestines with that camera. They also took a tissue sample of my intestines, and based on the analysis of that tissue sample and of the picture they took of my intestines, they could see that my intestine had been damaged. Even recently, I had another doctor looking at those results from when I was diagnosed with celiac disease, and that doctor said, you definitely have celiac disease. So it's pretty clear that it is not a fad diet for me. I am not a medical expert, so we need to see what medical experts have said about those with celiac disease or gluten intolerance, I'm going to name a few medical organizations that have talked about the severity of celiac disease and gluten intolerance. You probably haven't heard of some of these medical institutions. I'm talking about institutions like the United States National Institute of Health, or if you're in the United Kingdom, the United Kingdom National Health Service. There's also some small universities that you've probably never heard of, like Johns Hopkins University, or Harvard University, or Stanford University. I'm joking, you've definitely heard of all of these organizations and universities, and yes, they're very well renowned, and yes, they do amazing scientific research, and all of these organizations talk about the severity of celiac disease, of gluten intolerance, and the importance for those with these conditions to avoid gluten. Would these medical organizations, and basically every other medical organization in existence, talk about the need for those with celiac disease and gluten intolerance to avoid gluten if avoiding gluten was just a fad? That's a tall glass of nope, they would not. That doesn't make any sense. Multiple countries around the world, including the United States, the European Union, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, have minimum labeling requirements for gluten-free food, meaning that manufacturers of food can only label food as gluten-free if it contains less than or equal to 20 parts per million gluten. For those of you who are fans of the metric system, that's less than or equal to 20 milligrams per kilogram. Additionally, there are third-party certification organizations that will certify that a manufacturer's food product is gluten-free down to 10 parts per million or less, which is half of the standard that countries have. Would these countries and these third-party certification organizations set this requirement if avoiding gluten was just a fad diet? No flippin' way that would happen. They wouldn't do that. That's just no. Multiple countries also offer economic relief for those that have been diagnosed with celiac disease. Some countries offer it in the form of tax deductions, and you can submit the cost of gluten-free food as a medical expense and receive a tax deduction for doing so. One country offers vouchers to help those with celiac disease cover the cost of gluten-free food. In the UK, at least in some parts of the UK, you can actually get gluten-free food as a prescription. Would these countries offer these economic relief incentives for those with celiac disease if avoiding gluten was just a fad? Nope, 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 nope. They wouldn't. There are multiple organizations that not only offer support for those who are on the gluten-free diet, but that also promote research for a cure for celiac disease, that are actively fundraising to fund research for celiac disease, that are actively petitioning the government to give more funding to cure celiac disease. And there are drug companies that are working on creating drugs to cure celiac disease. In fact, I am currently participating in a clinical trial for a drug to treat celiac disease. These organizations that I was referring to include the Gluten Intolerance Group, the National Celiac Association, Beyond Celiac, the Celiac Disease Foundation, and the Canadian Celiac Association. So would all these organizations exist and be petitioning the government for funds for research and be fundraising for research to cure celiac disease? And would I be participating in a clinical trial for a drug to cure celiac disease if this was all a fad? That's a hard nope. Definitely just no. No, 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 no. The gluten-free diet is definitely not a fad for those who have celiac disease, gluten intolerance, or a wheat allergy. Please go ahead and give that like button a little tappity tap tap. That way we can help educate the masses that the gluten-free diet isn't a fad for those who medically need to avoid gluten. In the coming weeks, I'm going to publish a video about whether or not it's okay for those on the gluten-free diet to eat a little bit of gluten, and about whether or not the gluten-free diet is hard to follow. If you're watching this video after those videos come out, I will link them somewhere up here. If you're watching this video before those come out, I will be pointing at absolutely nothing, and you'll just have to wait for them to come out. Peace.